One of the primary roles of a leader is to provide synthesis. So, what's synthesis? Synthesis is when you take information from a bunch of different sources and combine it together to reach a conclusion, to generate a new piece of information, a new direction. We have seen a dramatic decline in most people's ability to do synthesis. We live in a world where everything is chopped up into little tiny pieces, where information comes at us in tiny little morsels. And a lot of people have lost the ability to draw bigger conclusions based upon that data. They have a piece of data, and that data stands on its own and doesn't serve to inform greater conclusions. The modern world seems to be actively encouraging this kind of behavior. It wants you to take everything as independent of everything else, to not consider nuance, to not consider the interconnections that exist in our world. In video game development, we have seen this manifest in the hyper-specialization of a lot of different disciplines. What often happens is that individual contributors can become so focused on their discipline, so focused on implementing the thing that they are responsible for, that they can lose the larger sense of game development. Ideally, you want to build a culture on your project that promotes synthesis at every level of development. You want individual devs to see themselves as video game developers working on this game first, and artists or animators or writers or designers or programmers second. You want them to remember the game that they're building and be able to think about how the thing they're working on is going to connect back to that larger goal. If you don't have that, in most cases you probably don't have that with at least a large percentage of your dev team, then the leaders need to provide that synthesis. They need to stand a little bit farther back and be able to gather a bunch of data, look at a bunch of different things, and to draw conclusions and guide things based upon that information. Often pretty loose information, often very incomplete information. One of the reasons I push for triage so heavily is because it gives you a wide swath of information. It's very thin because you're just seeing bugs, but you're seeing bugs across the entirety of the project. And this is giving you inputs that you can then use to draw conclusions about the entire project. One of the ways that triage can actually fail to do its job is when the group doing triage is treating each bug as fully independent of all of the other bugs. This can happen because you have leaders who aren't capable of doing synthesis. This can happen because you're taking your triage and spreading it across the entire team and having a bunch of independent teams do the triage of the project as a whole. It's useful for individual feature teams or individual content teams to do their own triage. But the triage that I advocate for the most strongly is a project-wide triage that sees all of the bugs through a bunch of different lenses, because that's what allows this project-wide synthesis to happen. But it requires long triages with people that are willing to engage in that process of synthesis. When you have leaders who are coming from a single discipline, they can often become hyper-focused on that single discipline. And then you end up with a project that ends up leaning further and further in one direction and ignoring the fact that this has to all come together into a single project. When I've worked with other studios, I've often described my role as a synthesis engine, as someone who can gather small amounts of information very quickly and use that to draw conclusions about what is going on and what needs to change. Am I always right? No, of course not. In a lot of cases, the thing that really hurts projects is a lack of synthesis, is a lack of bringing things together. So often, any conclusion is better than no conclusion. In most cases, drawing things together into something that's not quite right actually makes it easier to realize that it's not right. Whereas what you often see in development these days is the construction of these giant piles of atomic components that do not come together into a game. At the grandest level, synthesis is when the pieces come together to make a game. But if you can synthesize as you go, if you can draw the individual art assets into some sort of cohesive whole, if you can draw even an individual combat encounter into a cohesive whole, then that final act of synthesis that generates your game is going to become simpler. So why is this happening? Well, there are some fairly obvious reasons, and one that I think is a little bit more nuanced. From a scheduling perspective, if we treat every single asset as an independent item, it's actually a lot easier to do scheduling. Now, there's a big problem with that, because potentially what we're not scheduling for is the cost that we're eventually going to have to pay to synthesize this giant pile of independent assets into something. And indeed, one of the ways you see a lot of projects completely come off the rails from a scheduling perspective is at the point of integration, at the point when things have to come together. If I'm an individual contributor, treating my asset as an independent thing allows me to make less compromises. It allows me to focus on my craft. It allows me to do what I would consider a better job without having to worry about the other parts of the team. And as teams have gotten larger and larger and larger, it has become more and more difficult for me to draw a line back from the thing that I am working on to the overarching goals of the overall project. One of the reasons why I have been pushing development philosophies like Pile of Sand, like the Hourglass, is to try to help with that, to try to give a brighter lighthouse for people to look towards, to try to draw that connection for their own assets, to encourage that lower level synthesis that modern dev teams seem to have so much trouble with. But I think there's something more than all of this. I don't know if this is just old man yells at cloud, but to me it feels like people have gotten worse at synthesis. This might be because of hyper-specialization, but I think there's more to it than that. I think societally, we've become more focused on individual bits as opposed to on the whole. I'm not sure I have the best answer for why this is happening, why we're becoming more atomized in our thinking. Maybe it's that we are focusing on STEM and we're leaning away from the softer side of thinking in the humanities. Maybe it's something else. I feel like social media is certainly making things worse because it's chopped up even the way that you get data into smaller and smaller pieces. Can I even point to data to show that this is even happening? And I guess my answer to that is I would argue that that's kind of the point. The fact that you might be feeling like, well, prove to me that this is happening is almost proof in and of itself that it's happening. Because we didn't used to interact with the world in such a hyper, show me the data kind of way. Something that I've realized in the last year or so, as we've seen large language models come online, is that something that a lot of these AI models are actually, I'm not going to say good at, but at least capable of doing, is a form of synthesis. It's basically how they work. You feed in a bunch of data, and then they use that data to draw conclusions, to barf out some piece of content out the other side. I would argue that what the AI models are doing isn't truly synthesis. It's like a mutant photocopy of synthesis. But I do think that one of the reasons why people are drawn to a lot of these models is they feel that it's doing something that they've, in a lot of cases, lost the capability to do. So are we going to see leaders replaced by AI models that do some sort of robotic form of synthesis? I hope not, because as I said, I think it's a mutant photocopy of synthesis, but I think that there is a possibility that that might occur. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't think that corporations care one way or the other. If they feel like a large language model can do an adequate job of leading a team, they might just go for it. predictability might be a more desirable outcome than perfection. I think everyone should be striving to do more synthesis. I think that when you are working in game development, think about how the thing you're working on plugs into the greater feature, and then how that feature plugs into the greater game. And think about whether what you're working on is actually what should be worked on. It can become very easy to just simply check the tasks off your checklist. And in some cultures, that's all you're going to be allowed to do. But often, the people who rise through the ranks are the rare people that are capable of doing more than that, are capable of providing that synthesis in order to draw the pile of assets into a game. At the end of the day, making a game is an act of synthesis. It's an act of taking a bunch of different things and combining those things and manipulating those things to create another thing. I would argue that one of the reasons that we're seeing difficulty in game development right now is because we're having a problem of synthesis. As the number of assets gets bigger, as the team gets bigger, it becomes harder to synthesize all of that stuff into a single conclusion. When a game is simpler, that conclusion is easier to draw. When there are less people on the project, it's easier to bring everything together. It's easier for everyone to be involved at a higher level. But additionally, I think that we are getting worse at doing this job, worse at drawing the pieces together into a whole. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have a Patreon now if you're interested in supporting the channel in that way. There's a link to that in the description as well. Both Patreons and channel members get access to our Discord. So if you're interested in interacting with our community in a deeper way, this is an excellent way to do it. I feel like synthesis is something that a lot of people are getting worse at. And I do think that modern media, the modern communication channels that we have are discouraging synthesis by pushing towards very atomized thinking and very atomized communication. But am I full of crap? Let me know down in the comments. Sometimes you hear this called within corporations high-level thinking or strategic thinking. I would argue that in this context, these are all basically the same thing. There are scientific definitions for synthesis, and I'm probably violating that definition, but whatever. Basically, same thing. I will see you again soon. Thank you.